Hello everyone, welcome to Limbo. My name is João and today I have the pleasure to share my conversation with Oliver King. This was such a complex conversation. Like Oliver really knows about what he's talking. And so we spend a lot of time exploring his role as a VC, as an investor, as a founder, as someone who was really early on artificial intelligence, and what are some of his thoughts about the future. So we ended up talking about Oliver's journey from working in a lab to then going to an hedge fund, and what were some of the things that he learned from one place that he could apply in the other. And we also talk about the fact that he doesn't like the concept of agency, which is a concept that nowadays is being thrown around basically everywhere. And so I really enjoy how contrarian he was about that. We also talk about human flourishing and the role of institutions nowadays, and also what are some of the things that he looks for when he's a founder in founder mode and when he's in investor mode. I've learned a lot from this conversation with Oliver. I definitely want to bring him back to an episode 2 where I can explore even deeper some of his phenomenal ideas. You should definitely go follow Oliver on Twitter and LinkedIn. He's really open to conversation, so I think that you're going to really enjoy his profile and all of his content if you enjoy this idea of artificial intelligence, economy, investing, but also just this human flourishing element is something that's very strong in the way that Oliver goes about doing things. So yeah, this is my conversation with Oliver. Before we go, just a quick note from our sponsors. The Socratic Experience, the school where I work on, we're trying to revolutionize education through the Socratic method. You can learn more about us at thesocraticexperience.com. Contexto, the non-profit that allows for Limbo to exist, and then of course Limbo, the restaurant in Lisbon that gives name to this podcast. That being said, here's my conversation with Oliver King, and please don't forget to follow and subscribe. All of the links by Oliver and by myself are in the description. I'll see you in the next episode. Here's Oliver King. Hi everyone, welcome to Limbo. My name is João, and today I have with me Oliver King. Oliver, welcome to the show. How are you?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on, Joa.
No, thank you for taking the time to do this. I'm really excited about this episode because there's a lot of so when I started the Limbo, I started this podcast because I had a couple of other podcasts where I was focused on like this niche idea, and it took me a while to understand I cannot be defined by a niche. I just love conversation with everyone. And so like the idea behind Limbo was basically being able to talk with everyone. And I feel like you're the type of guest that you are and what you represent and what you do is very different from the types of guests that I've had so far. So I'm really excited about this conversation. And I guess it's a first good question. So you do so many things. Like if people ask you like, so Oliver, like what do you do? Like how do you usually answer to that question?
Depends a lot on who's asking me. Most of my conversations are with other early stage founders, and depending on whether or not there's a good fit in terms of, we should work together, I either take the investor's view or a potential partnerships view. So from the partnerships view, I say something along the lines of, I help early stage founders with their go to market. I tend to position myself against the VP of sales, right? Founders between seed and Series A ought to not make any hires, but founder-led sales is really tough. So
Mm-hmm.
my thesis is that they should either be driving deals forward in meetings, focus on customer success, and not much else. But there's a bunch of other high leverage tasks that they should do. It's just not them that has to do it. So delegate it to me. Some version of that pitch. And from the perspective of the investors, I tell them something along the lines of, hey, I'm building out a cash flowing business where I'm basically building out AI agents in the capital market space. Um, and as this business is generating cash, because I'm essentially lifting and shifting workflows, I'm thinking about what are some higher value workflows to target.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, one of the things that I'm interested in right now is what does it look like to sell an equity research pod in a box? Of course, inside this box is AI. And these things, they change all the time, right? I'm always tweaking, iterating on the positioning of it, seeing how people react, what resonates and what doesn't. But maybe the very simple and short way of saying that is I tell my friends that I work in tech.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great summary. So I would love to go into these two different routes that are part of your journey. The first one is, of course, the route of the founder. You've founded a bunch of different projects. We were talking before you didn't record that you were very early on AI for most people's standards, and I want to go over that. But also, as you mentioned, like you're also you play this role of the investor, and I would love to understand like how do you got to that point, and maybe some of the lessons that you're learning by also doing that. Let's start with the founder. So you founded three different projects: Oak, Mythmaker, and Steel AI Startup. And I would love to understand, like, if you could walk me through what's the flame that ignites this need of just starting something new. Were you when you were a kid? Were you having the typical lemonade stand and trying to sell different lemonades for everyone? Is that need to be an entrepreneur something that is part of your life, or was it something that you developed?
I mean, gosh, when you frame it like that, it's definitely the case because I remember in middle school, I was selling gum to my friends. A stick of gum for $1 in the cafeteria, right? That sort of thing. And in high school, maybe this isn't the appropriate thing to share with you or your audience, but I started selling weed when it was still illegal, right? So the basics of it is that you buy in
Yeah,
bulk, you package it up, sell smaller units of it, you capture the
yeah.
difference, you buy more, etc. In college, I transitioned out of that and I started working in a lab. And I think that was my first brush in with what I understand to be bureaucracy and just institutional inertia now, right? In retrospect. So working in a lab, I was really frustrated because I thought I was going to, like solve cancer and save the world, that sort
Yeah,
of thing, right? I was like going
yeah.
down the PhD MD route in biochemistry, but that is not what it looked like from the perspective of an undergraduate volunteering, right, and doing like stipend-based projects in a
Yeah.
laboratory. Um, and that was probably my first big disillusionment with what work looks like. Um, the through line from there to all the way now is actually some version of computational modeling. So when I was in college, my favorite coursework was statistical thermodynamics, right? And I forgot what it was called, but it was some version of biophysics, right?
Okay.
Where you're basically building out physics-based models of how it is that different molecules and systems within a cell behave. And the lab that I was working at was basically studying bacterial warfare. What happens if you put two different populations of bacteria in a closed system? How do they interact with each other? And specifically, what are the enzyme kinetics of whatever it is that's
Oh.
happening? And enzyme kinetics, right, in the concept of, let's say, human warfare, might be what are the sorts of weapons they're using, right? What are the size of the bullets? How fast do the bullets travel? And what is their ability to pierce armor? Something like that, right? Um, when I was fully disillusioned with what it looks like to go through the academia grind, I pivoted on what I thought was the most fascinating aspects of my coursework and my lab work, which is just modeling, right? And I thought to myself, okay, I'm really interested in how societies behave and develop because I was really disillusioned with my society, right? Academia. And I had the skill set. What is it that I can do to combine these two things and do something else? Because I knew for sure I was not going to go down the PhD route. Um, the answer that I
Well,
came to was basically to like break into quantitative finance, right? It's a very high paying job. And maybe through the rationalization of that, I thought to myself, you know what? I feel like markets is a good structure that aggregates human will, right? When markets move, humans move. And if we're talking about capital allocation, maybe markets, to some extent, right, fundamentally expresses how it is that the human organism behaves. Um, and at this time, I was like all over the place, honestly.
yeah.
So I was doing some like website development. right? Just getting back into coding. I pretty much taught myself, had a bit of exposure through the lab work. And I was also getting into crypto. Uh, Although when I asked my parents for money to invest in crypto at the time, they basically said this is the dumbest idea ever, right? Like, don't do it. I'm not going to give you thousands of dollars to trade internet money, which makes total sense back then, and I suppose for some people even now.
Is this
Um,
when is this located? Like what year are we talking about?
this was 2013, 2014. So
Okay,
pretty
wow.
early in the Bitcoin cycle. I think it was only like a couple
Yeah,
bucks at the time. I wasn't very high conviction though, because hey, when I started making money, I could have bought crypto, but I didn't.
yeah,
Um, so I was like spinning around then, and I think my mom really helped me out, right? Because she worked at a hedge fund. I interned at this hedge fund when I was in high school, and I was already developing my own trading strategies. I wasn't really thinking about how it is to like get back into it.
yeah.
But that was my like I guess my first business, right? I was already trading, and I basically got acqui-hired out of college, right? Which is
Wow.
not a bad thing. So I joined this hedge fund, and I initially joined as like an analyst, right? Where hey, maybe there's some strategy development you can do. You develop good trading strategies, you make some money. Um, but I felt like there was a lot in the process that could be improved on to make things a little bit more
Mm,
efficient, because the tools that I was using was really difficult to use, right?
mm-hmm.
Um, so because of that, I basically started getting into more and more of the operations. And from the perspective of a hedge fund, the primary operation is R&D, research and development. Find good trading ideas, vet the trading ideas, and then execute on it to make some money, right? Um, I basically started getting into there. So instead of focusing on the object level, I started focusing more on the systems level.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that, you should know is that back in the day on Wall Street, quantitative analysts, quantitative researchers were basically like the first data scientists before they were called data scientists.
Yeah,
And they are the precursor to most of modern AI ML, at least before
and
the whole
algorithms.
like large language model, thing took off.
Yeah.
Um, so I was at this hedge fund, and I was building out systems or meta systems, right? If you think of a trading system as a system that would do computational R&D at scale. So the sorts of thing that I was doing was, how can we explore a certain search space much more efficiently, and how can we harness the value of that R&D for the next step more efficiently, right? How is it that we can flow like more throughput through these pipelines so we can do it faster at any given moment in time? How is it that we control risk across the portfolio now that there's so much volume we have to manage? That
Yeah.
sort of thing. Um, and I won't get into the details of it, but long story short, I helped the founder of that hedge fund exit,
Which one?
because we built
Okay.
out this platform, right, which increases generally the enterprise value of a business, because now you really
Mm-hmm.
have an asset versus like a collection of scripts that someone has to tie together themselves.
Yeah.
Um, that was, I suppose, second exit, right? So the hedge fund was acquired by a larger family of funds, and after a year, took out my took my earnout and left.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to do something similar, but for a different asset class and a different type of data, because in the financial services and capital markets, typically you work with very structured data when it comes to public equities, right? Um, I thought, what would it look like if I applied the same lens of R&D at scale for unstructured data, right? There's probably some value there because it's really freaking hard. I have no idea how to do it. This seems like an interesting problem to solve. Uh, and I thought, okay, if that's the case, and I already started getting into, you know, um, the startup scene in New York, what would it look like if I could help early stage founders while exploring this R&D at scale idea? Because from some lens, entrepreneurship is society's R&D engine, right?
Mm-hmm.
Research and development. And if I could just help 5% of entrepreneurs not fail, right, I would double the amount of successful entrepreneurs. And those seem like the sort of asymmetric bets that are really attractive to me, right? Um, so the idea was really, okay, if I need to help early stage entrepreneurs succeed or at least not fail, and I have a data engine that then produces insights and it compounds value over time, creating a data and analytics mode, how is it that I can actually do this, right? Um, and I only knew what I knew at the time, which was some version of being a prolific networker and adding value where you can. Uh, so I took these ideas and I basically went into like quote unquote like the social impact space, right? Like who are the entrepreneurs doing the most good? Because you should niche down when you're starting a
Yeah.
business. Who are doing the most good? Who could benefit from my services the most? And how do I help them succeed? So the idea was basically I would accelerate zero uh, from like in 90 days, these businesses from pre-revenue to revenue. In 90 days, I'm going to help you earn some money, right?
Wow.
Uh, and I did do that for quite a few. I won't get into like exactly what I learned unless you want to double click there. But the short of it was that it was a lot of freaking work. It was a lot of work, and I was working with GPT-2. At least that's where I started because I needed something to like interpret and spread the data at scale. Because otherwise, how am I going to work with 20 entrepreneurs at once? I will drown. And I remember in like the summer of 2020, ChatGPT 3 came out, or sorry, GPT 3 came out, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is
This is
amazing, right?
awesome. Yeah.
And there were all of these papers coming out of the Watson and MIT collaboration about neurosymbolic AI, and it's called GraphRag now, right? Like how do you encode unstructured data into structured data, and uh, that was a huge unlock. But even then, like it was such a grind. Um, Mostly because I learned about the nature of entrepreneurship. So it seemed to me that I had this pretty valuable asset, or at least lens of thinking about the world, but because it was such a grind, I wasn't picking up enough data, uh, and I came across Techstars, right, where we came across each other. So I was basically hired by Techstars, and Techstars is uh, sometimes the largest, sometimes the second largest subletter program in the world, right? Uh, they're basically like Y Combinator for everywhere else. And they had 10, 15 years of data to work with. They started in 2008, right? And they were basically building out this function where I would get a team of engineers to go and just implement this at scale.
Yeah.
So okay, this is amazing. I can abstract myself away from the nitty gritty of working directly with entrepreneurs and all that it entails. I can work with all of this data and basically spin up this engine. And I was so in love with this idea of, okay, what would it look like if I could benefit from the lessons learned of every entrepreneur before me, right?
System.
Because if you
Yeah.
organize all this unstructured data and you deliver it in a
Exactly.
timely and relevant manner, it's like, oh, I'm about to step into this pothole, right? That someone else already stepped in, and I can avoid it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I joined Techstars, and again, the through line through all of this is just like, okay, how do we leverage this AI engine to capture valuable unstructured data and make it useful, right? Uh, so I was at Techstars for a couple of years, and at this point, I had been in quantitative finance, or at least on the public equity side of things, for 5 years. It was close to 5 years in VC, um, and I left my W-2 because I realized I wasn't learning fast enough, and AI was accelerating. Like I could feel it, right? The opportunity cost was growing, and I realized that if I wasn't going to ride this wave, I was definitely going to get left behind.
Yeah.
So I exited Techstars early 2024 to build out what I consider I guess, my third business, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Beefmaker.
yeah, and I knew I wanted to work with early stage entrepreneurs. The energy is electrifying. I knew of something in AI operations. I just didn't know exactly what it would look like, and that's pretty much where I started. So I tried out a few ideas, but where I landed on now is basically like a service business, like we were talking about a little bit earlier, right? I partner with early stage entrepreneurs at a certain stage, and I do a bunch of work for them. So they interact with me, and I interact with AI systems and team, and I'm basically filling that gap.
Yeah. So first of all, that was I have so many questions out of that answer. So if you don't mind, I would love to go a little bit way back. When you were mentioning like the dissatisfaction that you got with academia. Like I have so many friends that go into science in high school. They get ready for that role, and then they get into the lab, and they're just flabbergasted by what you were saying around the huge amount of bureaucracy and the kind of a lot of times like these projects that are very far from what they were expecting. Like these were people that had high ambitions, that really wanted to have a positive impact in life through academia, through research, and then they have like these brick walls. They hit this brick wall, and you, like as you were saying, like you went around it. You basically decided, okay, this is not for me. How can I do it? And you went for another side. But I have a lot of friends that just once they hit this brick wall, they just end up conforming with it and finding like these internal excuses of, you know what, maybe it is what it is, and I need to be here. So I guess that was the fact that your mom was part of that hedge fund the biggest issue, like getting you out of there, or do you feel like you had any kind of internal dissatisfaction that was strong enough to say, like I won't conform with this, I will build something in a different place?
I sometimes think about this because what she did for me, making that introduction, was huge. It put me on a high prestige path, and it gave me a mentor to learn structured decision making skills from, and how to think about systems, right? Really, I think important skills in today's
Yeah.
world, especially. That being said, I also think that it burned some time for me because I was working at a W-2. It was mentally stimulating, but it was also a big enough space that it swallowed some of my entrepreneurial ambitions, right? And frankly, throughout the time there, again, I loved it. I had a sense of being in golden handcuffs, right? Being in golden handcuffs because even though I was challenged, a big thing for me, working with really smart and ambitious people, a great thing for me, I didn't feel like I was moving my life forward, right? It felt more
Yeah.
like the worst parts of it, that I was like a parasite on society, where I
Yeah.
was basically trading and enriching the already rich. And that sort of
Yeah.
thing like creates a bit of moral debt. And I think because of that, I would say that it's in my nature to be disillusioned. It's in my nature to fall in love, dig really deeply, right? Become disillusioned, and then choose what to do next. I think that's a very masculine urge, actually, where you fall in love, you realize all that it entails, the responsibility of being in love, and then the younger and more immature among us run away.
Yeah.
Um, that's how I would describe my early years. I think now I'm less prone to running away, and I am much more comfortable dealing with like just the nitty gritty, dirty work of actually adding value and getting things done. And gosh, I can even point back to when I was in high school. Like, I did not like doing sales. So what I would do is I would just front the capital, buy the weed, and have people go and sell it for me, right? And I would
Distribution.
just hang out while they're making phone calls and doing meetups.
Yeah.
Um, it's very different now. Now I'm like on the front line doing founder-led sales. I don't know if that answers your question or not, but
No, I think it does. So it's definitely one of the things that really sparked my interest was the fact that you work around a lot about around systems, and interesting enough, like when you were mentioning like the work in the lab and in biology, you were also talking about systems in the way that these bacteria would interact. Do you think that when you shifted to quantitative finance and just to these systems of data. Do you think that was there anything that you learned from how biological systems work that helped you like contextualize these different kinds of systems, or did you had to learn everything from scratch?
I think when you work with enough systems, enough people, everything kind of starts to pattern match, right? Um, One of the things that I more or less capitalize on was there's a lot of ways to express this, but basically, one of the core principles in biological systems is that things exist in equilibrium. And when things are out of an equilibrium, certain things happen to get it back to an equilibrium. And that this is something that fundamentally biological systems take advantage of. So, to give you two examples, right? If you have a gradient where there's a high concentration of, let's say, like beneficial molecule A on one end and a much lower concentration on the other end, this beneficial molecule A spreads, right? So even though it's produced in one spot, because it diffuses out, it ends up in the spots that really need it the most. And you can take advantage of this as well, because since this naturally happens, like a dam blocking water, when you prevent it from happening, you create an energy differential. So the way that some of your cells function in terms of producing energy, right, is that it concentrates um, some molecule within the cell, and it creates these little dams, right, dam outlets. I forgot what it's called, like these release valves on the cell walls. And then when certain things happen, basically the energy passes through and you capture some of that energy, right?
Got it.
Um, and that sort of thing is also probabilistic because it's easy to describe, okay, great, there's a gradient and there's a deterministic factor of this just always happens. But this is really an aggregate of countless molecules interacting with each other, bouncing off of each other, right? And eventually following this like more deterministic route because that's just what happens in a system of this kind.
Yeah.
Trading is actually exactly the same, right? You and I, we might think, okay, Meta is down 10 points, it's up 10 points, whatever is the case. But underneath it are countless traders, right? Trading against each other, thinking about when to take positions and when to not take positions. And when you view it from that perspective, right, you actually see this in order book data. If you go on Coinbase, for example, right, you see this little chart where different traders are taking different positions at different price levels. And you can literally see things chipping away at large price levels. And then when that happens, it like the dam breaks and suddenly there's not enough liquidity to stabilize the price and price moves really fast in one direction or the other, right? Um, Now, again, this is all probabilistic because, hey, in let's just say 30% of the time when a specific price level is approached, depending on whatever dynamics are happening on the buy and the sell side, you might not break that wall, and instead you might get rejected, right? And you might get pushed down. Um, Being able to aggregate those sorts of signals and model it out is effectively what algorithmic trading looks like.
Yeah, that's such a great comparison. So let me ask you just one more question before we go, and I ask you a couple of questions about how, like the investor perspective. You mentioned that one of the things that you enjoy is asymmetric bets, and looking at basically your journey, I see that you have this relationship with risk. Like how would you define that? Because a lot of people would do the opposite, so they would focus on some of the things that are more certain, and they wouldn't go through like, or they wouldn't be interested in asymmetric bets, and yet you seem to thrive under that. So how would you describe your relationship with risk?
It's definitely evolved over the years, but at least in my current understanding, if there is some recurring fixed cost for taking bets, let's just say I scratch a lottery ticket every day, right? Um, and on one of those days, I have a chance to just win it big. Why wouldn't you, right? Uh, Especially if it's affordable, right? If it's affordable and you're taking bets with huge upside, you would be a fool not to do that. And I use a lottery ticket example on purpose because you would be an idiot to actually play the lottery, right?
Yeah.
So, what is that difference? I think the difference comes down to what is your likelihood of success and how much of that likelihood is within your control.
Mm.
Because as soon as the likelihood of success becomes within your control, you can basically take actions that start to compound, right?
Yeah.
And compounding is the thing that makes risk fundamentally asymmetric. In finance, this is called convexity, going back to the price level breaking and the dam breaking, right? That's an example
Hmm.
of convexity because suddenly, once you've broken through a little bit, everything changes, right?
Yeah.
And you unlock the next level, and then suddenly
Yeah.
it explodes, right?
Exactly.
And if it's within your control to chip away at that dam, or at least assess the likelihood of it happening, right? You
Yeah.
can drastically change the equation in your favor. At which point, the question then becomes, how do you de-risk yourself? How do you not be stupid? And how do you learn and get an edge so your expected return on whatever bet you're taking improves? Because when it improves, you're still paying that same fixed cost, but the rewards become greater and greater and greater over time because your risk, right, gets lower and lower and lower over time until you're basically guaranteed to succeed,
Yeah.
right? Um, and I don't think that's a thing that most people internalize very well, especially if you're well socialized, you grow up in institutions, you work W-2 jobs, that sort of thing. Um, because when I started my third business, I, I built six figures in a few months, right? Uh, and for some folks, they're just mind blowing. How do you do that? From my
Yeah.
perspective, it's like, how do you not do that? Like it's a really simple playbook. You just go out and you just sell, see who needs, who has a problem, and how do you add value to it, right?
Hmm.
Um, but
I
that's
love how.
probably because I've internalized this lesson.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. No, I definitely agree with that. So, how do you manage? So, would you say that as an investor, what's the how much do you actually control that small the probability of the dam breaking through and having like that asymmetric outcome? So, because I would assume that as a founder, like it's easy to make these asymmetric bets because you understand, oh, okay, so this is within my control. Like I know, once again, I just go out there and just sell, figure out who needs this, and I control that. But as an investor, I'm assuming that you're allocating way more of the probability onto other people. So how you navigate that?
Yeah, well, the cookie cutter answer is that when things become too complex, as are all sufficiently large bets, you really have nothing to go on except for the whoever you're trusting's ability to execute, right? And let me give you two examples. So in early stage investing, I'm talking about like pre-seed seed stage. There's basically two signals that investors look for, right? The first is your ability to be concise and communicate well. So, for example, when you apply for Y Combinator, they ask you to describe your startup in 100 characters or less. If you haven't done that before, it's pretty tough. It's pretty tough.
Yeah.
Uh, and the second thing that they ask for is your unfair advantage. So these two things in combination is the recipe for success, or at least the prerequisites for success. Because if brevity and clarity is your superpower, it means you know how to focus on the right things and how to communicate that in a way that people care about, which is crucial in sales and recruiting, right? The two primary functions of building a business. And if you have an unfair advantage, that means even if competitors start to rush into the space because you're succeeding,
Yeah.
you'll always have a leg up and you will be able to outcompete them, even if they have a ton of capital fueling whatever that looks like, right? The rest of it is completely outside of an investor's control, outside of the founder's control. That's a given, right? At that point, there's just some basic filters on the downside where it's like, okay, are they tackling an industry that they reasonably can
Yeah.
tackle, right? Like, is there a big enough TAM? But too many folks over index on downside, where really the signal is in clarity slash brevity and your unfair advantage.
Yeah. So, what would you say is your unfair advantages as a founder and as an investor?
As a founder, I'm in the go-to-market space, so sales and marketing pretty much, right? My unfair advantage is that I'm working with really technical people in a very niche industry, right? And I'm coming at it with a systems lens. It's kind of like how when quantitative finance started becoming big on Wall Street, they didn't hire finance degrees. They went and found
Yeah.
rocket scientists because rocket scientists can learn finance. You can't do it the other way around. And I think I'm in a similar position where I'm basically competing with salespeople and marketing people from the lens
Yeah.
of, systems and measuring data-driven outcomes. Um, as an investor, I don't think I have an advantage, like
Okay.
fundamentally, right? Uh, if anything, I maybe have the curse of knowledge where I know too many things, and because my, let's just say, time is spread pretty thin, I take fewer bets than I ideally would like to because of the whole like loss of diligence, right?
Okay. Yeah. So let me ask you something. One of the things that I'm teaching a class on emerging technologies at the school where I work in, and one of the questions that we debate a lot is, regardless of the kind of technology that we're developing, what are some of when looking at the future, what are some of the skills that we can safely bet on being important, regardless of whatever happens in the world from a technological standpoint. And one of them is definitely systems. So let's say that you're clearly someone who has been working with systems, who understands it. If you had someone reach out to you and say, "Hey, Oliver, like I want to understand systems. I want to like begin to develop this systemic view of things," what would your game plan be? Like, how would you recommend someone to develop that?
Oh, that's a great question.
Thank you.
You know, there's a book that probably all system thinkers know, Thinking in Systems by Donella Meadows, right? Definitely start
Yeah.
there. Once you get there, I feel like as you're reading, and everyone should be doing this nowadays, as you're reading, give questions back to ChatGPT, right? Ask it to explain it to you, and then ask, who else is talking about this? Who else is thinking in this direction? Because something pretty important happens when you get exposed to a lot of different perspectives talking about the same thing. You become a bit. Joa, do you know the word cell and shape rotator meme on X?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. You start becoming a bit of both, where not only
Yeah.
are you a word cell and you get hyper precise about what people mean because you're trying to intuit what they actually mean, but you start to be able to rotate that across different perspectives, right? And being able to do that, you basically start to aggregate all of these different worldviews. And when you
Yeah.
aggregate it, naturally, the signals become stronger and the idiosyncrasies and the noise becomes a little bit weaker relatively to the larger themes, right?
Yeah.
So I would definitely suggest starting there. And in terms of how it is that you navigate these systems, I just want to say that there's a huge difference between academic learning and understanding what it means. Because you can spend your entire life reading white papers from the best hedge funds in
Papers.
the world, and you will not know how to trade and what it's like to trade and make investments. Because the moment you take exposure, right, you feel it. And it's one thing to understand it mentally and be a master of that knowledge. It's another thing to know what it looks like to react instinctively within the body. And then it's a third thing to be able to actually map the two. So then can work reflexively on, how it is that you actually react in a situation, both in short and long time horizons, right?
Yeah.
Um, so I guess to summarize, start with the mental, build out a world model so you can effectively pick out the signals in your body and then just go straight into talking to people. Because at the end of the day, humans are social creatures. Most of our systems are social realities, right? So just
Yeah.
go and see what it looks like to try and pull on a leverage point, right? And try to affect change because
Yeah.
you'll actually see what it means to
Yeah.
navigate systems, institutions,
I, I
bureaucracy.
I love that answer. One of the things that I feel like it's also like a challenge is, and that's why I feel like a lot of people are aware of thinking in systems as as a concept. There's an idea to explore, but they don't actually end up doing it. Is because one point that you were saying is that you can start to have this knowledge, and then you're starting to compare different perspectives, and you're aggregating worldviews, which is a concept that I love. I feel like a lot of people are highly resistant to this idea of aggregating worldviews because they get tied up into their own worldview, and they see aggregation as proof that they were wrong, and that prevents them from actually developing a better worldview or a more complete worldview. Do you agree with this? Is this your like? Do you think that this is what happens to a lot of people, or not so much?
That's definitely the case. Uh, I think and talk about making contact with reality a lot. And, you know, frankly, if you can't get over yourself so you can even survive, right? And thrive in whatever changing environment you exist in, like you're just not gonna make it. Which is fine because on some level you're already not making it, right? Because you're already rejecting reality. So wherever
Yeah,
you are, happy or comfortable, good for you. At some
yeah,
point in my life, it'll probably try to save you. Nowadays, it's like it's up to you, man. You can either get over
yeah,
yourself or not, learn something or not. Like everything is an
yeah.
opportunity. That's why you make of it.
Yeah, I feel I'm still in that phase of trying to want and save these people. I'm still behind you on that, because it's one of the things that I just don't get. Like, why would you stop yourself from being able to see reality in a deeper and more complete way just because you're afraid to? Yeah, go
Oh
ahead. Sorry.
gosh. Can we get into this? It might be a little bit controversial.
Oh, please do.
Okay. So I've been thinking about this since I was 17. The way that I
Wow.
asked it then was, why do people not do things that are good for them? And they already know that it's good for them, right? And the thing that I went to back then was being slightly informed about politics, because what happens at, a political and governmental level actually trickles back down to you. So just put in the bare minimum and just go vote for something. Like, why do people not do that? And for the longest time, I thought it was because they were too busy with other things. So they were deeply distracted, which is why I killed all of my social media, right? And then I thought, okay, maybe they just don't have enough resources. There's no entry point into dense literature. So if you could just make it easier for them to learn. And then I
Yeah.
thought, okay, maybe it's not that. Maybe it's some version of impulse control, right? Where if you give them a classroom setting and some accountability mechanisms, they'll actually go out and learn it, right? And then I thought, okay, maybe it was our upbringing. Maybe it's because they never really learned how to emotionally regulate themselves, so they can't deal with
Yeah.
discomfort, and because they can't deal with discomfort, right, they can't even begin to approach reality.
Yeah.
And then I thought, okay, there are a bunch of people who none of these things apply to. Why aren't they going out and looking for self-improvement, looking for more knowledge, working to improve not just themselves but society? And right now, I've come to the conclusion that some people are just fundamentally irredeemable, and I just don't,
Yeah.
because like even if you have everything in the world to lose and you're actually already on this path, for whatever reason, these people are not doing really obvious things, like just putting into ChatGPT, hey,
Yeah.
what should I do next? They've never thought, who else is thinking about this? How can I get some help? How do I, do this faster, do this better? How do I waste less time?
Yeah.
I don't know why people do it. I don't think it's an intelligence thing. I just think some people are not wired that way, right?
Yeah.
And in fact, they're only that way because there's enough people around them who've socialized them to go and seek self-improvement. But if that didn't exist, they would just be chilling. They
Yeah.
wouldn't care. I think
Yeah.
a lot of people are just social creatures and they do not exist outside of a social reality. I'm no judgment. I don't know why, but for me, it's
Yeah.
just
It doesn't make
irredeemable,
sense.
right? They don't
Yeah.
care.
I totally agree with you. This is something that I've been thinking a lot about for the past few months because I've had a couple of people close to me where it's like you organize their environment in a way, you organize a system in a way that allows them to get to the finish line. And then the only thing that they need to do is once at the finish line, they just need to take the step to cross it and they'll get there and they'll stop. And that like that it feeds me reading like how can that be possible? And the main conclusion that I've arrived is something similar to you, which is I feel like everyone has the potential to change. That doesn't mean that they will act upon that potential. So if the incentives change in a very strong way, if suddenly like other people put you on a path where just by acting normally, the system itself is designed in a way that prevents you from failing, as long as you don't have to have any kind of free will in order to make a certain decision, maybe you'll get to that point of self-development or getting something done. But the moment that it's up to you, even though people have like this potential of change, they won't act upon it. And some people, as you were saying, like I feel like some people are literally just hardwired that way, and it boggles the mind. I don't I'm not able to understand it, but yeah. So okay, so I would love to have your perspective on the future, and so part of the reason why I started to read a lot of history and a lot of science and a lot of philosophy was because I feel like I was always this person that liked to understand what's going to happen and to think about, well, what are some of the next steps. And I've quickly realized that the best way for me to understand or to be able to craft an hypothesis that might be less wrong than all of my hypotheses is by understanding, like by collecting data and realizing, okay, so what are the patterns, and based on those patterns, what are the elements in the current situation that I see that can be somehow similar to those other patterns, and make a prediction based on that. And I feel like you've been in touch with data for a long time, across a multitude of different areas, because that's one of the advantages of working entrepreneur. As you were saying, like entrepreneurship is kind of the R&D of society, right? And because of it, it happens in a multitude of levels, in a multitude of areas. So if you're working with entrepreneurs across a bunch of different places, you're getting information from a bunch of different sources, a bunch of different areas, and you're combining them all into a single place, in this case, you. So with with all of that context, what are some of the predictions around the future that you feel fairly comfortable betting on?
It's funny. I recently started a podcast called High Conviction because I don't feel particularly safe betting on anything other
Okay.
than the fact that anyone who is sufficiently knowledgeable and inclined towards humility, I would imagine would say something similar. And it's because of this, and this is a cop out answer, that I would safely bet that we're actually in the singularity. Uh,
Wow.
it's really difficult to predict how things are going to shake out right now,
Mm-hmm.
aside from predictions at such a high level that it hardly matters. And that is the definition of the singularity.
Mm.
I can try to stake out some really narrow claims,
Yeah.
but it's not going to extend beyond this domain. So,
Mm-hmm.
for example, I'm pretty positive that the process of hiring an AI agent is going to look very different than a human, right? Because
Yeah.
there's so much of being a human that gets communicated through body language and, frankly, vibes, right?
Yeah.
And that sort of thing compounds in trust. And for my 10 years of working in AI systems don't have that charity. So when all of our social infrastructure and human nature, I think, right, is built on delegating away complexity through a
Mm-hmm.
wrapper of trust, and now that wrapper of trust is no longer available, and measurement is really effing hard. There's a lot we can talk
Mm-hmm.
about there. What does it look like to hire an AI agent? And what does it mean on a systems level? I have no idea. I just know that it's going to be weird. There's going to be some weird implications when you don't trust the people that you're working with. I don't know what it means for
Mm-hmm.
our psychology. I don't know what it means for organizational design. but
Do,
I do sense there's something big there.
do you think that we're going to like cope with that by um, so we'll basically replace the feeling of trust not with the AI agent, but with the creator of that AI agent. So I may not trust this AI agent because, once again, as you're saying, like trust doesn't exist in that level. But I know that this person designed it, so like it's almost like this proxy trust happening to the agent.
So I think that a big part of that is true. It's why everyone has bought into the Copilot paradigm. If you've worked with AI systems and rolling out to production, this is a natural conclusion. The problem is that you cannot compete with folks who don't need them. Because when trust is the bottleneck, right? When trust is the bottleneck, then you are fundamentally rate limited by other humans. So,
Yeah,
for example, if you're competing with a guy who uses 10 AI agents, right? And that guy is responsible for overseeing those 10 AI agents and you trust the guy, great, right? It's a believable story. One
yeah,
guy managing 10 agents. Now, the next guy comes along and he's managing 1,000 agents. There's no way, no way.
yeah.
I don't even think you can do
You're
it for
right.
10 agents, frankly, right?
Yeah,
That you can execute oversight across 1,000 agents. But if those AI agents are engineered in a way that is, I wouldn't say trustless, but in a way that you can manage the risks appropriately, that guy's going to blow everyone else out of it, right?
yeah.
And because of that arms race dynamic, I don't know, like, again, what that means. I just know for sure that I don't think Copilot is going to be the end state.
No, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And so you mentioned like these. How is this fundamental shift in the way that we relate with the idea of trust is going to affect us? Like, what do you think is going to happen in that sense?
I don't know. I think when you're confronted with something on the magnitude of AI, or let's say from the perspective of a more simple human mind, when you're confronted with catastrophe of your village, let's say the Mongols are coming, right? You basically have three choices. You can put on your armor, you can find some friends, and go and defend the town gate. You can run away and hope the problem doesn't chase you, or you can basically just give up, right, and go about and eat your dinner. I don't think enough people are aware of this thing that's happening yet, at least in a way that they can internalize it. Again, there's a big difference between knowledge at the mind level and knowledge at the body level.
Yeah.
That anyone is quote unquote running away. There's definitely folks who are attuned to it because the vast majority of people aren't doing it, so they're trying to ride the wave, like me, I would think. I think the majority of people are just living their lives because they have no lens to contextualize what this actually means for them. And
Yeah.
help me get back on track, Sharon. Did I answer your question?
No, yeah, yeah, I think you did. So I think that a big part of what we're talking about, especially when you're mentioning the difference between these people that, chose to put on the armor and find some friends and go and fight or surf the wave, ride the tiger, whatever metaphor you want to use, I think that one of the biggest differences is agency and the notion or the concept of how much agency do I have over what's happening. And to be fair, like a lot of has been like agency has been blowing up since a couple of months ago when the high agency essay by George Mark got released. And but to be fair, you've had agency in your vocabulary in your Twitter for a long time. Like I've been following you for a while, and I remember that was something that because it's funny because agency in Portuguese doesn't have a very good translation. And so every time that I use it, people look at me like I'm crazy. Like, what do you mean? It's usually like we use agency in a way that, you have marketing agencies or something like that. And so maybe because of it, I've always been interested in on how can I explain the concept of agency. And so every time that someone talks about it, I'm very sensible to that. And and so you recently posted a tweet recently. I'm not sure how long ago it was this. Maybe probably a month ago, something like that, where I kind of grasped that tweet when we were doing research, and I kept thinking about it, which is you wrote down high agency in service of what, and I feel like that's one of the most important questions. because everyone keeps talking about having this sense of agency, which I believe it's a great thing to do, and I want to ask you about it. But it's also important to understand. Sure, you have agency, but what are you doing with it? So I guess it's like two different questions. The first one is, what's your relationship with agency, and how you ended up with the set of beliefs that you have about it, and also how would you answer that question yourself? Like, your high agency is being used in service of what?
So I actually think the conversation around agency is one of the biggest disservices uh, that I
Really?
can
Oh,
think
wow.
about in the modern internet discourse. Because agency is one of those things that only makes sense in retrospect. When you're thinking about things in retrospect, you can basically trace out the perfect line of decision making, right, and heroics that explains why you do the things that you do. I did this thing in pursuit of a goal. And yes, most of that is true even at that point in time, but I don't think that's what agency actually looks like. I think what agency actually looks like is, damn, I have this thing. I don't know what I'm going to do, right? I don't know how I'm going to do it, but I'm just gonna like put it outside, break it down into composable tasks, and just do one thing. Um, and I think that's something that anyone can do. So when I said high agency in service of what, right? I was thinking more along the lines of if everyone can break down and decompose a problem, if you're sufficiently intelligent, why aren't we? And probably it's because you don't know what you actually want to do. And knowing what you want to do is very different than breaking down a problem, and it's very different than dealing with the emotional regulation problems that come with being out of your depth, which is where ideally you are all the time as an entrepreneur. That's what I don't think agency really makes sense, except as a signal to other people who are high agency.
Okay, so that's so interesting. So, in your view, agency is not so much about the actual pursuit of the goal, but the capacity of looking at something, deconstructing it into smaller parts, and start acting upon them. Yeah, that makes sense. I never thought about it from that lens, but that makes sense. So, can you speak a little bit more about high agency being like this signal for other high agency people? Like, what do you mean by that?
I think it's just in group signaling, right? When you talk
Okay,
about
that sense.
agency, you're putting into a wrapper so you know what to do with it, so you can use it. So, for example, when we're talking about AI agents, what I've described is exactly how AI agents work. You break down a thing into smaller tasks,
Yeah,
and then you have the tools to go and execute it, and then you evaluate whether or not you've done it well. And that's something that anyone can do, right? Now,
yeah,
humans, the emotional regulation layer. But when an agent is not acting, what does it do? It doesn't do anything. Is it still an agent? By every definition, I think so, right?
yeah,
Um, so uh,
yeah,
when we're talking about agencies, like, great, you know how to problem solve, right? You can emotionally regulate. You're smart enough to figure out where the signal is and where the noise is. So I trust you to execute. But like, are you actually executing, right? And if you are, why are we even talking about agency? Agency only exists where there's nothing to actually serve. There's no ambition. There's no vision that's being chased. Because otherwise, you're like, oh yeah, Sam Altman is so high agency. Huh. Like,
yeah,
yeah, I guess, but that's because you know what he's doing, right?
yeah. That's a very interesting and refreshing perspective. So I have two more questions that I want to ask you. The first one is, scattered across this conversation, there's this idea of emotional regulation. Like, from the moment that we talk about trading, and the fact that, it's something to know, as you were saying, like, it's something to know all of these different systems, and then there's a very difference. It's a big difference between knowing those by reading papers and then actually seeing it into practice. Once again, here in the conversation of agency, you need to have like this the emotional regulation. So, and you seem to be one of from my understanding of what you do, and even from this conversation, like, you seem to have a very good notion of that and how to balance like these three views of the mind and the body, and make sure that you're able to understand the emotions rising in your body, and then still finding a balance between the knowledge that's purely abstract, the emotion that's purely raw, and trying to find a balance between these two to understand how to act. How, like, what did you do, or how did you work on this emotional regulation yourself to be able to do it at the level that you do right now?
Uh, that's a really good question. Um, on some level, a lot of my personal development is inseparable from my interest in spirituality from a young age. Like I remember doing mushrooms when I was like 16, and I just started the thought of like, what does it mean to be a human? What does it mean to be a human? Right?
Yeah.
I'm not really into spirituality anymore, but I think having a level of self-awareness of how you react in terms of impulses and emotions and automatic responses, and also being aware of that, right? It breaks a bit of that loop where something still happens, everything is still automatic, but if you have enough self-awareness, you can create enough distance emotionally with that moment and not be identified with it. And then think to yourself, okay, maybe I didn't handle that very well. Maybe I was super cringe, and instead of falling into like a trap of rumination about, how cringe you are or how terrible you are, you sort of think like, okay, what can I actually do about this, right? Where did I slip up? How do I avoid that in the future? And how can I try to keep this in mind for the next time it happens? And I think once you start getting into that loop, you basically break these like automatic cause and effect chains, right? And then you start to be able to steer a little bit the cause and effect of, hey, maybe I wasn't very well regulated last time, but next time before I lose my temper, maybe I can think to myself, okay, I'm talking to someone that I want a good relationship with. How do I do this with good intentions, with kindness, and make this conversation as productive as possible? And then over time, that just becomes your new normal, right? And
Yeah.
you just gradually ratchet up the quality of your normal.
Yeah. It's a good answer. Thank you. You mentioned like this relationship with spirituality and deep interest from a young age, and eventually you mentioned also the departure of that interest. Can I ask you what happened? Like, have you did you arrive at a specific conclusion? It just stopped making sense. Like, what happened in there?
Uh, I think for me, when I was referencing that there's a big difference between knowing something and like actually living it in your body, a lot of that started happening. And then the mind body connection started to relate less and less to spiritual language and spiritual perspectives, and more with just human ones, where it didn't seem to make sense that certain things were contextualized with this grand epistemology, when in reality, a much more human lens was more relatable and easier to find traction with. So the question that came up for me is, if human language is easier to find traction with, why is spiritual language used? Presumably
Yeah.
to avoid traction. So a question that I've been thinking about recently, right, is like, in spirituality at a certain point, you come to this point where you're like, okay, let me honor myself and like lean into my authenticity, right? And I like to work with counterfactuals. It, the spiritual language is called shadow work, right? So let's just say that you're trying to honor your intentions. And let's just assume, right, that those intentions don't map to a grand epistemology. They mean nothing for your spirituality. They mean nothing for your higher self, right? And you know for certain that this is just a childish impulse that you're trying to rationalize. And the human brain is built to rationalize things. You're just trying to rationalize a childish impulse. Are you still going to do it? I don't know.
Yeah.
It, for people who like meditate and do past life regressions, right? And like they worship at the shrine of ayahuasca like once a quarter. If they knew for sure that all of this was just them getting drugs and playing with their biomechanics and pushing their
Yeah,
biology around and it mean nothing at all, would they still do it?
yeah. I don't know. I guess that it. My answer to that would be that it depends on the internal narrative that you have about it, which which which, which kind of, yeah, which kind of ties into a question that I have then, which is like, what's your relationship with myth then? Because I feel like in myths are these like ways of arranging reality in a way that conveys a message that's true across a multitude of areas or times. That's my definition. And I would love to understand like what your relationship is with that, because to answer that question, I feel like maybe a lot of people that are doing ayahuasca every single quarter are, have this built-in myth of that representing something that actually doesn't,
Yeah,
like that in actuality doesn't represent, but for them within it's actually like it's living that myth. I don't know.
yeah. Uh, I think myth storytelling is a human social technology for coordination. So when you tell the right myths, it's easier for you to self-regulate and it's easier for you to work with other people who can buy into a similar myth. Because beyond all of that is really agency in service of what? At the end of the day, right? If you know for certain you're just a child acting out your impulses, right? You know for certain, and there's no myth around that. You come to a very naked question of why am I doing what am I doing?
Why am I
Is
doing
it worth
this?
it?
Yeah.
Is there value? And then you start to think about, okay, am I self-serving? Does this have consequences for others? Are those positive or negative consequences for others? Can I bear those consequences? Can I put in the work to make this thing happen? Right? And then the question just becomes why. And without any myth, you can't answer why. And it then just comes down to because I want to and serve my own self, or I want to because it's good for other people. Or in the worst case, I want to because it's bad for other people, in which case you're serving yourself, right? And you're a
Yeah.
sadist. Myth is a helpful technology, so we don't have to make those choices as transparently. Um, and it's just generally fun, I think,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, that's a very good answer. Okay, Oliver, I have two more questions. Last question, that's a quote unquote serious question. What's your relationship with learning?
Um, I love learning. I think my new favorite activity is falling into a ChatGPT rabbit hole where I'm basically just asking it to synthesize things. I dig into different directions I don't know. It is so much better than the Wikipedia rabbit holes that I used to fall into. Um, because even the course of saying, hey, that's not quite right, you figure out what it is that you were missing before in your perspective and different ways of triangulating what it is that you're actually trying to figure out. So yes, I love learning. I don't know if that answers your
How?
question.
Yeah, no. It does, because and you kind of answer like the follow up question, which would be like, how are you using AI to promote that learning? The only reason why I'm asking that is because I feel like the both the identity of founder and the identity of investor entail huge amounts of learning, and that's why I was wondering. And so through ChatGPT, just it's a very technical question, just out of curiosity, like, are you feeding it different sources? Are you just relying on its own internal model? Like, how is that working out?
Both. I think
Both.
I think what a lot of people don't do when they work with ChatGPT is they don't ask open-ended questions. When you ask open-ended questions, you can break out of your own limited thinking, right? And you can ask for, let's just say, five options. And when you ask for five options and then ask for a synthesis afterwards, you also know how those options relate to each other. And when you can do that, right, it's basically a choose your own adventure. And I
Yeah.
would also add that, like, if you're not naturally inclined to this, right, you should find a context in which you do feel that sense of wonder to like
Yeah.
encounter a new idea and be like, wow. and then just index on what it looks like to experience that feeling, and then try to produce that
Search it.
feeling when you're actually doing things, just all the
Yeah.
time. Right? Yeah.
Yeah. That's that's probably one of the best career advices that we can give anyone. Like I love that how find wonder at about any topic and then like understand how does that feel like in your body and just go and search that. That's such a great answer. Okay, I promise that that was the last question, but I remember I was just looking at my notes and I have one last question that I would love
Here
to
for
ask
it.
you,
Yeah.
which is so in your Twitter bio, you have a bunch of different things that are ideas that you care about, things that you care about, and one of them is human flourishing. And I would love to understand what do you think that looks like?
I think what that looks like, from at least my perspective, as let's say someone who is of service, it means being able to give anyone the opportunity to rapidly accelerate whatever it is that they want to do. And I think that would have three effects. One, for folks who are working on hard problems and need allies, it accelerates the pace at which folks are being developed, and it helps with talent density. And two, for the folks who just, let's just say want the status of having done something, right? We can speed that up. They can get disillusioned and then they can figure out what happens next. Because when gratification is instant, you stop getting gratification, right? And I think three, when you speed up the pace of development, um, there's there's a lack of wisdom that comes from learning too fast and being too smart. And I think having that lack of wisdom be exposed in folks who are very formidable and very knowledgeable can be very sometimes beneficial because you're basically getting an outsider's perspective on a field, right? And you're maybe learning something that you were previously jaded by. But also, you can see who's dangerous. And when you see who's dangerous, you can manage that a little bit better. Um,
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. Oliver, this was phenomenal. Thank you so much. If people want to find out about you, if they want to reach out to you, if they want to know more about you, like what are the best places to do so?
I think just shoot me a message on Twitter, probably. My
Okay.
handle is Leifer King, OLEIFRKING. Otherwise, you can probably find me on LinkedIn as well. If you type into the URL, it's the same handle. Otherwise, just look for Oliver King Mythmaker.
Yeah. Well, Oliver, once again, this was wonderful. Thank you so much for taking the time. I really learned a lot with this episode, and as I said, like the kind of guests that I usually have, like I think you were such a of fresh air. So thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks for having me on. It's always fun to jam out.
Oh, yeah, thank you. And to everyone else, please go and follow Oliver on all of the social media. Also, listen to his podcast, High Conviction. We'll leave all of the links in the description. And in the meantime, if you want to subscribe to our channel and leave a review for our own podcast, would appreciate it. Thank you so much, everyone.